Nothing compares to the Atlantic slave trade, that's true. But is that a reason to remain silent about another slave trade? No, interim. From Senegal and from all over Africa, millions of people were deported, not to the Americas, but to the Arab and Muslim world. According to the latest studies, there were between 15 and 17 million of them. This slave trade lasted no less than 1,400 years, from the 7th to the 20th century. Yet this trade is reduced to just a few faint dotted lines on the UNESCO map. Even though leading historians are working on this issue, Salah Rabelzi is one of the foremost experts on the Muslim slave trades. He too regularly faces the consequences of ignorance.
I recently attended a significant conference in Morocco, and during one of the sessions, an attendee took the floor to emphatically state, "I genuinely do not understand how one can truly associate or even meaningfully compare slavery in Islam with other distinct forms of slavery, especially since in our cultural context, slaves have always been exceptionally well treated."
Slavery has been practiced since the dawn of time by all peoples, Egyptians, Romans, or Greeks. But while Christianity put an end to it in the West, the Arab world continued this tradition. In the 7th century, everything accelerated with the arrival of Islam and the conquest by Muslim troops, who quickly took control of vast territories.
It is widely and historically well known that from the very beginning of Islam, there was a profound and severe crisis or significant shortage of available labor, and that, among the compelling and multifaceted motives for extensive conquest, there was also the pressing and undeniable need to capture numerous people and turn them into enslaved individuals to create a substantial and readily available workforce that could be effectively employed in the various burgeoning sectors that were to be meticulously established.
From the 7th century onward, throughout the Muslim world, slaves quickly became omnipresent. Their role was even more significant than previously thought, far from the clichés of courtesans or the sultan's servants.
Research today shows that the number of slaves was greater than previously believed, and that they existed not only in bourgeois households, but also in rural areas, and that they were employed not only as domestic workers, but also as productive laborers, not to mention in the army and so on.
Alongside this, there is also a terrible reality. Slaves who worked in the mines, slaves who worked on hydraulic construction sites, and slaves who worked in salt mines.
With the development of the Arab-Muslim Empire, the slave trade became organized. Like the Atlantic slave trade, it was the business of professionals. Powerful trusts governed this trade, like those in Cairo. From the Middle Ages up to the 19th century, there was even a slave traders syndicate that negotiated public contracts with the state. In a Muslim world where every aspect of life is governed by religion, slavery, of course, is no exception. The Quran certainly recommends not being too harsh with slaves, but it does permit the practice.
Slavery is not justified by religion, but religion does legislate on slavery. The main point is that this is, in fact, an unequal society, and this inequality is reflected and legitimized in the text, since the Quran refers to slaves in several passages without ever questioning their status. And the opposite would have been surprising, because at that time, within the paradigm of the era, it was impossible to conceive of these societies without slavery.
In principle, Islam only permits the enslavement of non-Muslims. Thus, over the centuries, hundreds of thousands of Europeans, probably around 1 million, were captured. But the West defends itself. As white slaves become scarce, Muslims increasingly turn toward Africa. In Africa, many black people are Muslims. However, as we've seen, Islam forbids enslaving other Muslims. This contradiction will be easily overcome. As the African continent becomes the main reservoir of slaves, a form of racism develops to justify slavery, much like what happened in the Atlantic slave trade.
It should be noted that long before European researchers in physical anthropology developed the fanciful racial theories we know in the 19th century, in the Arab world, the inferiority of black people had already been cemented in time, almost irreversibly. And this was done by respected and influential scholars such as Ibn Khaldun.
Ibn Khaldun, the great scholar of the 14th century, who nevertheless wrote, "The only people suited for slavery are the blacks, because of a lower stage of humanity, their position being closer to that of animals."
It is certain that there is And here precisely I have shown that there are many qualifiers, a whole vision of the black person, of the slave, as an inferior being, etc.
There are several terms in Arabic. To say slave, one says abd. They would say rolam, genji, they would say eswed. Now what's interesting is that the term eswed means black. Genji will also be applied to black people from the East African region. So we will gradually see the regional or ethnic connotation become the equivalent of slave and its associated negative implications. This evolution in meaning is a significant linguistic and social development, reflecting historical shifts and perceptions. And even today, in many Maghreb societies, for example, in southern Tunisia, instead of explicitly saying black, people often say slave, they say abidi.
In the name of these theories, Africa experienced 14 centuries of slave hunting. Attacks carried out by soldiers in the context of war or by armed bands under the orders of merchants.
These attacks, of course, are of incredible violence. They set fire to the huts, completely engulfing these simple dwellings in flames. These actions are, of course, nothing less than brutal frontal assaults launched directly against entirely defenseless and vulnerable populations. And as a devastating consequence afterwards, these innocent people are cruelly torn away from their beloved families, forcibly separated from their ancestral homeland and all that they have ever known.
To capture one slave, the attackers kill on average 2 or 3 people. And in the villages there is one commodity that is especially sought after.
As a valuable commodity, of course, a young child is much more likely to be readily readapted, to be thoroughly acculturated, to be completely controlled and managed, whereas a mature adult individual would tend not to willingly accept such a state of servitude or subjugation.
For more than 1,400 years, the slave trade has followed almost the same routes. While the Atlantic route has left its mark on history, the Sahara has erased all traces of the slaves. 7 million people are believed to have passed through there, led by slave traders known as galabres or drovers. You couldn't tell the slaves apart from the herds of animals.
Only those individuals who were in exceptionally good physical health and possessed considerable stamina could successfully make it to the very end of the long and arduous caravan journey.
20 to 30% of the captives perished, a mortality rate close to that of the Atlantic slave trade. The survivors arrived at the slave markets of Cairo, Baghdad, Istanbul, Mecca, or Timbuktu. There, some of them underwent a horrific procedure, castration.
As sad and truly unfortunate as it is to have to say this, the barbaric castration workshops, and indeed the very nature of the operation itself, is a profoundly dangerous and irreversible medical procedure that regrettably and quite unfortunately leaves very little, if any, real chance for the castrated child to survive and live a full life. So the hope of survival for the child is still quite minimal.
The castration procedures killed between 70 and 80%. That gives you an idea of the scale of the massacre.
This also explains the very high price of eunuchs on the markets.
Despite its cruelty, the Eastern slave trade lasted until the early 20th century, without ever being challenged. At that point, we moved from drawings to photography. In 1880, English travelers discovered and photographed these boats loaded with slaves. These photos taken at the end of the 19th century give us an idea of an age-old practice. This shot, just as remarkable, shows slaves at work on a clove plantation. In 1830, 100,000 slaves worked on the plantations of Zanzibar. A world-renowned historian, Ibrahim Mathiub, is one of the few Africans working on the African dimension of slavery. He is one of the few to have pointed out the responsibility of Africans in both the Eastern and Atlantic slave trades.
That is to say, slaves didn't just fall from the sky. They had to be produced somehow. There was no power with the political, economic, or technological resources to come to the African coast, penetrate into the interior of the continent, and round people up from villages to export them. It was because certain African social groups, African elites, clearly understood the advantage they could gain from this external factor arriving on the African coasts and acted as intermediaries for the capture of slaves, organizing a fairly efficient economy that at the time raised no moral issues for anyone. It's only for us today that this raises moral problems.
The existence of these intermediaries points to another reality, even more taboo, hidden by this black and white version of history. This well-kept secret is that the slave trade was a widespread practice within African societies themselves, long before the arrival of Westerners and Arabs, and long after their departure. Millions of Africans were enslaved by other Africans, 14 million, according to the English historian Patrick Manning.
The Atlantic slave trade unleashed unprecedented violence within African societies starting in the 15th century.
Some kingdoms thrived solely on slavery, waging perpetual wars to secure a supply of human captives. Among African elites themselves, many of whom are Muslim, a sense of solidarity with the Arab world outweighs the need for historical reckoning.
There is a sense that great evil could come from the West, but not from their Muslim neighbors to the north. Today, the countries of North Africa and many others, at least in the Near East, have become very friendly with African countries. So all these groups come to an understanding at the expense of the West, but they've decided not to reopen this painful chapter.
However, there are courageous historians and intellectuals who have chosen to confront history head-on, sometimes even against their own societies. Professor Tube is one of them. One event left a mark on him. A conference in 2001, during which he dared to break away from the usual rhetoric and talk about all the slave trades.
What was the audience's reaction? In the audience, there were Europeans, there were Africans. I deliberately didn't say whites and blacks. I could have said it. For me, the issues I raised were odorless, colorless, and harmless problems, just banalities, and I thought no one would pay attention to my talk. The reaction from the room, at least from the African side, was much more intense than I ever expected. I didn't know that the topic I was going to address was so heated and so contentious. It was such a sensitive issue. Honestly, I wasn't aware of that. But I felt that in the room, there were people who stood up to say that what I was talking about was just stories, that I was going too fast. But I didn't hear any real criticism of my presentation, no scientific critique. But what explains it to me is this. When I had just finished delivering my talk in Bamako, which had indeed provoked that strong but not particularly scientific reaction, more of a deeply visceral and emotional response to my detailed presentation, when I eventually left the room, several Africans immediately came forward to see me. There weren't very many of them, but still it was representative enough of something for them to tell me, what you're saying is true, you're right. We need to explore this aspect of things, but we shouldn't say it in front of white people. And the Europeans came to see me. It was always the same story. To tell me, congratulations, sir. I think exactly the same as you do. You're very brave to say it, but I don't dare say it because I'll be accused of being racist. After listening to these two positions, which I understand very well, I said to myself, but where are the historians? It's high time to take the bull by the horns.
Ibrahima Tiobi is probably telling a story that's too complex for a time that needs simple truths. A time when fear makes people blind. A fear that is like the backlash of a troubled history whose wounds have not yet healed.